I didn't mind. I mean, animation turned out probably to be just as much work as, going to law school. But once you started, it clicked on, and you realize this is what you've got to do.
In this class, we're going to be looking at one of the most important principles of animation. That is overlapping action. Overlapping action goes super deep, so we're going to be looking at many different examples so we can break down the movement so you guys can begin to clearly study it and begin to put these concepts into your work. So what is overlapping action? Overlapping action is simply a breaking up of the movement so that it doesn't feel too mechanical and stiff. It adds a flexibility to your characters and an alive quality that really can make a good piece of animation great. If we look at this simple action of 5 balls bouncing, we can see that it feels pretty mechanical and stiff. If we take the same action and offset each ball 1 frame successively down the row, you can see how this really adds a whole new quality to this animation. It's literally the same exact animation, we've just overlapped the motion slightly, and to me it's just added a whole new looseness and sense to life to the whole shot. This is standard. There's no overlapping action. It's all happening together at the same time. So, basically, when you look at this, there is no overlapping action, which is really difficult. Ouch. But what happens now is, woo! There's overlapping action. There's overlapping action. So far we've been looking at how these different principles apply to the bouncing ball. In this class we're going to continue with the bouncing ball because we feel that the bouncing ball is really the foundation to great animation. Here we have the bouncing ball as we understand it so far. The overall movement is great, but now how do we get the character to not stay in place and begin to actually propel itself forward convincingly? We can start off by first adding the forward translation. That's the first step. That's easy enough. Now it's making a clear arc across the screen. But we can take this even further. It needs actually a feeling of thrust and direction change. If we add the ball moving forward, we need to really stop and think, how would this ball propel itself forward? Well, first we can start off by having the ball lean forward before it begins to move forward. That way we can see the direction it wants to go in. But if we leave it in that direction, it looks kind of silly, and honestly it looks pretty off balance as it comes down to the ground. It's at this point where the concept of overlapping action takes place. The leaning forward of the ball is a great start, but as we get to the top of the arc, the ball will need to change direction and overlap as it begins to pull down. This helps keep the character in balance and also serves to really loosen up the animation. This overlapping of the action will follow the arc of the ball as it moves upward, and then we'll start to change direction and follow the arc as it begins to move downwards. Here we have this same basic principle of overlapping action applied to a cartoon reference. Although the character is moving upward as opposed to across the screen, when he reaches down to grab the couch, his movement continues upward and then overlaps downward as he pulls himself down to the couch. In this example, it really helps give a fluidity to the movement and is the exact same method that we used on the bouncing ball reference. This is really the most basic examples of overlapping action. So now we're going to accelerate your learning and push you guys forward by showing you how this doesn't just apply to bouncing balls, but applies to most everything that moves. Overlapping action can be confusing because it has many different names with slightly different functions. So I've decided to group all these functions together and call them the overlapping action family. In the overlapping action family, there's 4 main areas. Number 1 is follow-through. Number 2 is successive breaking of joints. Number 3 is drag, along with the wave principle. And number 4 is lead and follow. The first concept in this family is what we call follow-through. When an object stops that has something attached to it like a tail, the action of these objects generally want to continue forward, then come to a settle. This is what we call follow-through. It's a following through of the action. It really can make a good piece of animation great, and is generally applied to extremities, things like big floppy ears on an animal, baggy clothing on a person, hair when it stops, the tail of an animal, and so on. If you look closely, you can see that these extremities are motivated by external movement. So that means it's really motivated by the forces that are acting upon it, like weight, wind, gravity, etc. So if someone jumps up, straight up, and then comes down and stops, when their body fully stops, the loose extremities like the hair and clothing continue to move. It continues to actually follow through the movement and adds a really nice looseness to a pretty otherwise simple action. Now let's look at this principle as applied to an animated object. Here we are looking at a simple block. This is the primary movement. This is the driving force of the movement, where the movement generates itself from. You could think of this movement as being the sphere of the bouncing ball, but really it is important to think of it as the driving force, like hips are to a human character. Now if we add an extremity like this pole, it would be pretty silly to keep it stiff like this. This is a really great opportunity to add follow-through. But how do we actually put this principle into our work? Well, it's important to go back in history and look at one of the basic laws of motion. As I said before, follow-through is motivated by the external force or forces of the primary action. In this case, the primary action is the block. Now, if we look at this same example again and apply these basic guidelines for motion, we can see clearly how the pole continues to move forward after the block stops, kind of following through the movement, as if it wants to continue, then begins to settle and relax. The pole will not move again until it's acted upon by the driving force, in this case the block. This gets into another concept of the overlapping family that we'll look at later in this section. The amount of settle an object has really depends on the weight of that object. So if we tied a ball to a string and applied this same example, it would go for a much longer time in reality. But again, animation is an observation and caricature of movement. So we can look at this and then say, okay, if I made it follow through like this forever, this might start to look pretty overdone. So this is one of those areas that really requires a lot of experiment and patience. With follow through, I tend to think less is more. If we start to overlap things too much, we begin to really get away from what we're trying to communicate to the audience. So with less is more, it's still there, it adds texture, it adds a sense of looseness to the shot, but it doesn't overpower the shot, and you can still clearly see what you're trying to communicate.
Overlapping is definitely important, but I remember when I first started animating, I had a tendency to overlap everything way too much. Yeah, just overdo it because, at that time when you're first discovering different things about animation and the principles, when you discover overlap and you figure out how to, overlap and make things wave, you want to do it because it looks so cool, so you start putting it everywhere. You start putting on the arms and the legs and the head, and you start getting everything looking like a big mess of waves, and it's cool at first, but you've got to learn how to tone that down and balance it so that overlaps happen, and you can exaggerate them, but you need to have them exaggerated at the right moments.
You can easily overuse it in the computer, and on the other side of it, you can easily underuse it because you can see your whole character hit at once, and then it's just dead. Nothing lives like that. Things moving in sequence, and that's kind of really neat to watch when it's working, when it's not too slow, and when the eyebrows will pull up the eyelids, which will pull up the pupils, pull up the face. And if the timing is right, it works great. But if it's just a little off, it looks rubbery.
Now we can take this example one step further and really see how you can apply follow-through to something with multiple sections. Again, the principle of follow-through is applied here. But how do you get this to look so smooth? To explore this, we'll get into the next area of the overlapping action family. This is really a technique that helps us break down exactly how something is moving so we can apply that principle into our work. In this example, if you look at each section, you will see that one leads as the next section down follows through, and so on and so forth. This is successive breaking of each joint. This is what happens in life all around us, but it is one of the many observing things that being an animator gives to us. We begin to see things really and see how they move for the first time, and to actually have a way, we use these principles to break down and study movement, whether it's live action or animated reference. If you want to experiment with a simple overlapping action test, you can simply animate the follow-through of the top section that's connected to the base of the driving force. Once you have that pretty well locked down, you can copy that curve down to the next section below it and offset it by 1 or 2 frames. When you first do this, it's going to be a little wacky because it's probably going to be too much. So what you got to do is then go into the curve and kind of bring it down and kind of adjust it so that it feels a little better, a little more in tune with what's happening with the one above it. Once you have that and it's starting to work pretty good, then you can pretty much just copy that down to the sections below it and do the same technique where you offset it by 1 or 2 frames. So continue to do this down the chain and you will see how this creates a pretty simple example of successive breaking of joints. Now you're thinking, wow, this is easy. I just copy, paste down the chain. This is good to go, right? And actually it's not. For about 8 out of 10 examples, this just really doesn't work. It's kind of in just a rare, simple case like this, kind of from a side view, that this principle works by copying and pasting down the bones. So experiment with it and practice with it, but in the end, it's kind of just something to kind of learn the basics of how this principle works in action.
The time that this takes to get here, let's say that it takes 2 frames. There's a huge difference between taking this primary force 2 frames to taking 20 frames. Why? Because if this goes to here in only 2 frames, that's going to affect how much overlap and how it overlaps for this pendulum. I would assume that in only 2 frames it would look something like this, and then it would be so much force and so much speed that right away the pendulum, it would almost be dragged so much, and then as soon as it hits here, it will go from here to here, almost in 1 frame. I mean, you almost would miss this one. Why? Because in 2 frames, if this is the force and it's only taking 2 frames, that's going to affect how fast the overlap of the pendulum is taking. But let's say that it's taking all these frames, we are almost not going to have as much overlap. It's not going to be as radical as this one. Maybe we'll have a smaller overlap, so the middle point almost cannot look something like that. Why? Because the timing of the primary force is definitely affecting the timing of the pendulum. So it's important to start dividing the timings of different things. You have timing of A, and that's always going to affect the timing of B.
Timing and rhythm is extremely important. I think a lot of people on a computer tend to have very even timings because it's real easy to go in and set your keys on every 10th frame, every 5th frame. So that leads to a lot of very, very heavy syncopations. That happened a lot on the Troll because he would take 2 steps and then hammer. So a lot of times it would be 1, 2, 3. And one of the things I learned at Phil Tippett's studio is to break up the timing. And Phil was very percussive when he gave animation feedback. He would say, you're doing it like this, ba ba ba, when what you need to do is like this, ba da ba, like that. So I learned a lot from Phil in that respect, that breaking up the timing in an intelligent way is much more entertaining than just having these syncopated shots.
Now, does it just stop, or does it slow in and out? If something just starts moving right away, the thing might just overlap instantly. But if something is slowing in, that slowing force is obviously going to affect the slowing of the pendulum, and it's very important to keep this in mind.
You know what? I feel like I spend a crap load of my time on those parts, on those transitions, on those ease-ins, ease-outs, when I'm polishing a shot, just to find like that just right amount, you know, where it's not floaty and it's not too abrupt.
It doesn't matter how many you have. The timing of here is going to affect the timing of here, and that's going to affect the timing of here.
But as you get deeper into it, you'll really see that it requires a studying of the movement. And in the end, it goes back to this basic principle, making sure one section moves first while each successive section breaks and catches up to the movement. If you use this method of copying and pasting down the chain in every situation, inevitably you're going to get poor, unobserved movement. Remember, animation requires study and observation of movement to break down each specific situation. So it's important to take a moment here to really think about what you're learning, because this principle will be applied to every animation you do from here on out. It's just something that really adds so much to the character. And if you take a moment to just say, okay, what's happening here? Does this just apply to extremities like hair and cloth? No, it doesn't. It actually can apply to almost every kind of movement. And for instance, we'll take a look at an arm reaching up. In this more advanced example, we can get a glimpse and just see how deep this technique can actually be used. If we slow down the movement and really break it down, we can see what is happening. The shoulder leads the action first, followed by the upper arm, then followed by the elbow, then followed by the hand. However, this is really a more advanced situation. It's really important to start thinking about the many different ways that this principle can be applied. So if we go back to the block example, we can take this even further. Drag is yet another member of the overlapping action family. It's a way for us as animators to have a term that visually represents something when we look at a motion and say this motion is dragging. It's really a term for us to help us break down the movement visually. So if we go back to this block example and have it start from a stop position, now add the pull, you can really clearly see how it actually drags as the block begins to move forward and then follows through the action on the other side. Now if we add in multiple sections, we see this principle of drag fully realized. Yes, the pull is successively breaking down each joint and following through on the other side as the block stops, but is also dragging as the block begins to start, as well as when the block stops. One leads as the other drags behind, then catches up as the latter section begins to drag successively. That's really why I've called these a family, because each go hand in hand and complement each other. Just like successive breaking of joints, drag can be motivated by external and internal forces, but drag is a way for us to visually see what is happening, whereas successive breaking of joints is a way for us to see how it is moving. Drag is one of those kind of almost hidden little treasures for animators. It's one of the things that I love so much. It's one of my favorite things in animation because it really adds a looseness to the character and really adds a fluidity to the movement that adds so much. So from here on out, in you guys' critiques, we're going to be kind of pushing you now to kind of understand that. So take the time to really experiment and explore with these examples, because the sooner you grasp this stuff, the sooner, and actually the more fun you're going to have with your animation, because you'll actually go, okay, I'm not just moving things around anymore. I'm actually moving things and I'm understanding why and how I'm moving these things. And that's an exciting place to be. If a character is hit by an outside object or force, the whole body will drag behind, successively breaking all the way down the entire body, all the way out through the fingertips.
Wave action is another aspect of what we call successive breaking of joints. And you've probably already heard a little bit about successive breaking of joints, how one joint will pull another joint. For example, if I'm going to pick something up, maybe in a really subtle way, or if you want to exaggerate it a little bit, that movement could be led by my shoulder, and then the elbow, and then my forearm, and then my wrist, and that's called successive breaking of joints. You know, starting at the top, and that chain of events ripples through the body. Okay? Wave action is another way to think about kind of the same thing. There's a slight difference in that wave action is usually used to refer to something that's being caused by external forces, such as wind blowing a flag around, or maybe a rodeo rider on a horse getting jerked around. The action going through his body is going to be a wave action. But that's an action being caused by an external force, the horse that's moving around. The cool thing about wave action is that it's a principle that you can apply to a lot of different things, but can also be analyzed in a really simple way. One of the most common examples of wave action is in a blade of grass. So let's say we've got this blade of grass here that's just kind of hanging out. And then some wind comes along and pushes the blade of grass, let's say, from this direction. So this piece of grass sort of starts to billow out, like that. Now this piece up here, this stuff hasn't started to move yet, because there's nothing moving it yet. So far there's some wind pushing here, and that's kind of pulling this part, but that hasn't traveled up the chain to this area yet. The next phase of this would be this being pushed even further out, and then almost all of it's being affected, just not quite the tip. Okay? And next you've got the whole thing is now being pushed along. Alright, so this was hanging out, and now it's going over to the side. Maybe there's even another one of those. So now it's blown over as far as it can go. And this area is going to continue going this direction while the bottom area starts going back this way. So this part starts to billow back this way, and you get this S-curve happening, where now the bottom is starting to blow back. But this part, nothing's affected it yet, because this stuff hasn't started to pull it yet. So it's continuing its downward motion, while the bottom part starts going back the other way. This is the essence of wave action right here. So now this really starts going back the other way, and you get your most extreme S right here. Boom. Alright, and now this stuff is starting to be pulled, but the tip is still headed this direction, because it doesn't know to turn around yet. Nothing's pulling it. Now you're going to have this moment where the tip finally flips and starts headed the way that everything else is going. And you're going to get something like this. Okay? And now that's going to continue along, going this way. So now you've got the blade of grass blowing the whole other direction. But eventually the same thing is going to happen on this side to happen on the other side. It's going to want to turn around. It's going to want to reverse and start blowing back the other way. And when that happens, the bottom is going to switch directions before the top, just like it did before. Just like this. And you start to get that S-curve again. And then it starts headed back the other way. And it goes right back into all this stuff. So if done correctly, a perfect wave action will end up with the tip of each pose occurring on kind of a figure-8 arc, like this. So you've got this figure-8 that's kind of a bent figure-8 that looks more like that.
An amazing example to look at for this is to take a look at how a flag blows in the wind. It doesn't just get blown around haphazardly in the wind. It actually follows the same principles of overlapping action. The wind pushes one section as the other parts break behind it successively, kind of dragging behind it, then catching up, and begin to start all over again. The pattern may seem random, but it's really reacting to when and where the wind is hitting it. So we can slow down any portion of this and say, stop! Right here, this is where the wind is hitting it. So I bet this area will now break behind it and then catch up. It's not really any surprise because it's just the principle of overlapping action in effect. So remember, these principles are based on real-life observation, and we use these as tools to break down and caricature movement. As you can probably tell by this name, it's just another term for us as animators that we have to break down the movement. We have all these different names, this overlapping action family of names, that each one is slightly different, expresses just a slightly different technique or different way to explain and express the movement. So from here on out, when you begin to look at something and you see that it's stiff, you'll really be able to see, okay, maybe I can add some overlapping here, whether it's in your work or in somebody else's work that you're observing. So take the time to study and enjoy it now.
Our world is pulled down by gravity, which means whatever we animate has weight because we're trying to make it look like it's in the real world. Our real world has gravity. The characters on the screen are going to have gravity, and so that brings us to lead and follow. Even when a character comes to a stop, you know, your hands are heavy. These are pieces of meat right here. There's bones in here. They're attached to a bigger object. When that big object stops, what's going to happen? I'm exaggerating here for a point, but you're going to have your follow and your settle, and even in here, you're going to have your arm leading and your hand's going to follow, and then the reverse. You know, so that's important. That's going to keep your character looking alive. It's not going to make him look stiff, rigid. It's not going to make him look like he's constructed out of, you know, Tim the Toolman Taylor's wood collection or something. You know, it's going to keep him alive. It's going to keep him looking like he's built and meaty.
With lead and follow, we can really look at most overlapping examples and say, this is just another term to describe successive breaking of joints. But as animators, we have a language we use to describe certain movements, and lead and follow and successive breaking of joints really go hand in hand. Now we can have a little fun here and look at the block moving in a figure 8 motion. This motion is really just an overlapping of the up and down movement and the side to side movement. If you guys play around with this simple example and you get it, it'll really help you kind of begin to see how just overlapping a simple object, just the side and side and the up and down movement, can really give you some visual interest. A figure 8 pattern, that seems to be like a really complicated thing, but really it's just side to side and up and down, offset from each other. It gives you this really nice pattern and can add a really nice visual interest to your work. Now let's add the pull. It's literally dragging and following through with each pass. Now when we add in the different sections, we can see how each section is breaking successively by having one lead and the next section follow. You can really have a lot of fun with this, so play around and see what kind of results you get with it. So you guys are moving up to your next character, and I wanted to introduce Taylor. Taylor is basically the same character you've been working with, the bouncing ball with the tail attached. This will let you apply all the principles that you've been learning so far in this class. It'll really let you experiment quickly with the things that you fully understand now about the bouncing ball and kind of add another layer of texture to it. But instead of just throwing you right into the mix and just saying go for it, I thought it would be more appropriate to take a look at some live action reference of what this character was based on. I always remember thinking, if I had to animate a squirrel, man, that'd probably be one of the hardest things to do. But actually it's based on the principles of overlapping action. So if we treat the back end of the squirrel like the bouncing ball that we understand so far, as it bounces up and down, we kind of can pretty much feel the timing of that and see how that's working. Now if we look at the tail, it seems to be complicated, but based on what we've been studying so far, it's completely based on overlapping action. As the back end goes up, the tail drags down from where it's connected. Then as the base gets to the top of its arc, the tail then starts to catch up and the sections behind it begin to drag behind it. Each section thereafter just kind of following the same path, successively breaking down and dragging the same exact way that we've been explaining it so far. So if I was going to be animating Taylor, I would first start out with what I know so far and animate the bouncing ball portion of the character first. This will let you get a clear base of what the character is going to do, where it's going to be at, and you really kind of nail down that portion first. After I have the main body motion figured out and animated, then I would start with the main tail section that connects to the body first, kind of get that feeling right, and then from there experiment with the different methods, maybe copying down or doing straight ahead the next bone, and really experiment with this stuff because each person has their own individual taste on how they like to approach this kind of animation. A really good example to look at for this character is the Scrat from Ice Age. The animators over there did such a great job. They used the tail as an extremity, but they were also able to use the tail as a personality characteristic of the character, because remember, a tail is something that is attached to the character. So it's not necessarily just an extremity like cloth is. As I move my arm, the cloth will continue to follow through. A tail does that as well, but a character also, because it's a part of their body, they're in control of that appendage as well. So you can use that as an acting tool or something to accentuate an accent if you want to, or you can use it as a means of follow-through. So as you can see, these are all really a part of the same family. It's really difficult to know where one ends and the other begins, because they're all very complementary of each other. So I really encourage you guys, if you can, is to just take the basic model of the block in the chain to really kind of experiment with the many different examples that I've given in this class. That's really what they're there for. We really encourage you guys to try out these examples. Although they're not a part of your official assignment, it'll really help you to understand what's happening visually, and something will click inside and it'll just change the way you animate, the way you think about movement from here on out.
It's funny, when you learn the basics, there's just, as a young animator starting out, there's nothing you want to do more than dive right into it. And I know that Beauty and the Beast, people had seen animation of Beauty and the Beast, and all these animation students right away wanted to start animating the Beast without any knowledge of the principles. And you got some funny looking beasts, not only in how they looked, but in how they moved. And what you realize very quickly is that the fundamentals are going to be used every day that you're an animator in varying degrees. So at the time, you think that a bouncing ball is very boring, but you realize that all of the essentials of overlap and lead and follow are there. You can give him personality with no face and no body, and you can do that with just the animation. Then you've accomplished your job and you're on your way to being a great animator.
So I'll just give you a little tip right now. If you take the time to study and experiment with this principle right now, when you start getting into acting shots and action shots, you'll really be thanking yourself for taking the time it takes now to fully understand this, because once you get into full-on characters, it starts to get really complicated, and if you don't grasp it now, it's going to be that much more difficult for you when you do get to those types of characters. So take your time and explore. That's really what we hope you guys are doing at this stage, because really what you're learning is a whole new way of seeing life, to really begin to explore and really see how things are moving. So just take your time, be patient, and in time this will all start to make sense.